So in today's session, we're going to look at Paul's perspective on Adam and Jesus, specifically as we see it recorded in Romans 5. A quick reminder of what we've been doing in this series. We've been looking at different ways of interpreting our origin stories, the Genesis 1 to 3 stories. And we've seen that there are multiple layers of meaning, especially when we come to the text with different questions. The text offers up a whole new world of meaning. Now, this method of finding layers of meaning within the scripture is typical of the way in which the Jewish tradition would discuss a text. For them, there wasn't just a correct and the wrong way of interpreting text. One meaning and all the other meanings are incorrect. Rather, if you look at the midrashic commentaries on these texts, you can see such a divergent, rich discussion about the possible meanings. Now, Paul, coming from a Jewish background, would have been well acquainted with that means of exploring the meaning of text. And so when he starts writing in Romans 5 and giving us a perspective on Adam and his relation to Jesus, he would be very conscious that this is another layer of meaning. It's not the one and only true interpretation, but just another layer of meaning. Now, I want to quickly summarize about what we've said about the Genesis stories and the text so far. One of the proposals we've put forward is that instead of reading it as a historic record of actual events, that these stories could be interpreted as the story of every human being. In other words, the way in which Adam's consciousness develops, the way in which he moves from a naive innocence into the complexity of relationship, the way in which both Adam and Eve partake of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in which their own will, their own power to experience both good and evil, both love and hate, brings them out of that childlike, naive innocence into the reality of what it means to be human. And so many of the interpretations and Jewish interpretations around this text would begin with the question, what makes us human, rather than what went wrong. And that kind of interpretation then leads us to, it's got a lot of implications. It means that a nostalgic longing for a lost original perfection is completely irrelevant. It's as relevant as you wanting your children to be 3 and 4 year old kids again. I mean, that when our kids were 3 and 4 years old, I wish I could have it again. It was a wonderful experience, but if they remain 3 and 4 years old, something's wrong. Although growing up involves a separation, involves a greater independence, involves maybe areas of pain, that is a natural, good part of becoming fully human. And so, to an extent, that is what Genesis 1 to 3 explores, this process of humanity coming into the full maturity of what it means to be human. So when we get to Paul in Romans 5, he indeed gives us another perspective of how to interpret the story of Adam. But maybe this story is not only about the story of every human being's development into full maturity, but there's a way in which to interpret it as the summary, as the story of all humanity. And human history, I think you would agree, contains a lot of death, contains a lot of missing the mark, contains a lot of violence. There's a story and the interpretation of human history that is filled with guilt and condemnation. And when you look at the atrocities, it brings many people to the conclusion, is it worth it? Is human life worth existence? Now, it's against this interpretation of history and human life that Paul introduces us to Jesus, who, in opposition to all the guilt, all the condemnation, all the sin, all the death, Jesus demonstrates the extravagant grace of God that says, yes, human life, despite all of that evil, is still justified. There's something about the image and the likeness of God that still has the possibility of blossoming within humanity. And Jesus comes to display the kind of humanity that is possible, a humanity that transcends the cycles of violence, of perpetrators of violence and victims. He comes to demonstrate a new way of being human, a humanity that, instead of wanting to get even, learns the gift of forgiveness. And that possibility, the possibility that human life can transcend the death, the violence, the guilt, the sin that is summarized in the story of Adam. That's the beauty of the story of Jesus. He comes to plant a seed within human consciousness, an idea that says we do not have to continue in these cycles of violence, that forgiveness is a real alternative possibility that can open up meaning and beauty in life that we'll never find just in the cycles of revenge. So one of the other things I quickly wanted to address as well in terms of Paul's interpretation of Adam is, did Paul think of Adam as an actual historic person? Now, we go around and we speak in many places, and very often I would refer to Adam and refer to that story, knowing full well that my audience thinks that Adam is a real historic person, and simultaneously I know that I don't. And I don't stop my whole story or interrupt it to try and correct that possible misunderstanding, because that's irrelevant in the context of the truth that I want to communicate concerning what Adam represents. And so maybe Paul as well, he used these stories without necessarily thinking that Adam was a historic person. Alternatively, let's imagine that Paul did think Adam was a historic person. Does that obligate me to consider him a historic person as well? Not really. There's a lot of things that's historical and culturally contextual. For instance, in Acts 16, Paul takes Luke, and because they were going to go visit some Jewish community, he convinces Luke to come with him so that he could circumcise him. Now, whenever I go and visit Jewish friends, I don't take my Gentile friends and try and circumcise them beforehand. That's why I still have some friends. But you can see that some of the actions, some of the convictions that Paul had was contextual to his culture and his history. In the same way, Paul did not have access to the kind of scientific literary criticism, to genetic codes, to the information we have today that gives us a better insight on humanity's origins. And so he might have believed that Adam is an actual historic person, but in no way does that obligate me to do the same. I can look at the actual meaning that he wanted to communicate, and it's a beautiful meaning. And in the context of those concepts and meanings that you want to communicate with that, I can most certainly agree. Thank you. Bye.